On a freezing winter night in a quiet American town, a former U.S. Marine locked up his small diner, unaware that one simple choice was about to change his life forever. Behind the building, an old homeless man was digging through the trash for food, silent, trembling, forgotten by the world. The Marine hesitated. He had debts, a child to raise, and nothing extra to give. But something about the way the old man stood, the way he watched the snow, felt painfully familiar. One meal turned into one night indoors. One night, uncovered secrets buried by the government itself. And before the snow melted, the Marine would learn a terrifying truth. Before the story begins, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to follow a journey where survival turns into responsibility, and one choice changes everything. Snow fell steadily over Ridgewood, Colorado, soft at first, then heavier, muffling the town in cold silence as winter settled in for another unforgiving night. Jack Miller locked the front door of the diner with numb fingers, the metal key stiff from the cold. At 38, he carried himself like a man older than his years, broad-shouldered, compact, with the quiet posture of someone trained to take up as little space as possible. His dark hair was cropped short in a way that never quite grew out, and a trimmed beard shadowed a face marked by sharp cheekbones and a permanent crease between his brows. People in town said he looked serious, distant, but those who knew him well understood the truth. Jack wasn't cold, he was careful. Ever since leaving the U.S. Marines and losing his wife 2 years later to a slow, merciless illness, careful had become the only way he knew how to survive. Inside the diner, Sarah Miller wiped down the last counter under the yellow glow of hanging lamps. Jack's older sister was tall and lean, with narrow shoulders and long arms that made her movements efficient, almost brisk. Her light brown hair, threaded with early gray, was always tied back in a loose knot, and her fair skin bore the faint redness of someone who spent too much time in dry winter air. Sarah spoke little, but when she did, her voice was calm and grounded, shaped by years of holding families together when things fell apart. She had moved in after Jack's wife died, not out of obligation, but instinct. Someone had to keep the place steady, and Sarah had always been that kind of woman. "You heading straight home?" she asked, glancing at Jack. Jack nodded. "Emily's probably already asleep." Sarah gave him a knowing look. "You still working too hard?" He almost smiled. Once the lights were off and Sarah headed out the front, Jack stepped into the narrow alley behind the diner to take out the trash. The alley smelled faintly of grease and snowmelt, the dumpsters half buried under drifting white. As he dragged the heavy bag toward the bin, a subtle movement caught his eye near the far wall. At first, he thought it was a stray animal, but then he saw a thin hand emerge from behind the dumpster, fingers shaking as they picked at something on the ground. An old man crouched there, hunched low, wrapped in layers that had long since lost their warmth. His coat hung off his frame like it belonged to someone else, stained and frayed at the edges. A gray beard clung unevenly to his gaunt face, and wisps of white hair stuck out beneath a knit cap that had been mended too many times. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the dim light, and his breath came out in short, uneven clouds. He was rummaging through a torn bag, collecting crumbs with slow, deliberate movements, as if each motion cost him something. Jack stopped. He had seen homeless men before, outside the bus station, under the overpass, but something about this one rooted him in place. Maybe it was the way the man kept his back pressed firmly against the brick wall, eyes darting briefly toward the alley entrance with every sound. Or the way his shoulders tensed at the clatter of a loose lid, as if expecting something worse than noise. Jack's first instinct was to turn away. He had a child at home, bills stacked higher than he liked to admit, and a diner that barely stayed afloat during winter. Kindness didn't pay suppliers. It didn't keep the heat on. That was what logic told him. But logic had never been the thing that stopped him on cold nights like this. Without a word, Jack went back inside. He opened the warmer and pulled out a container with a leftover roast beef sandwich and a side of fries. Nothing fancy, but still warm. When he returned, the old man looked up slowly, eyes clouded but alert. Jack crouched a few feet away and set the container down within reach. "It's warm," he said quietly. "You should eat." The man stared at the food for several long seconds, as if trying to understand whether it was real. Then, with careful hands, he picked it up. He ate slowly, methodically, chewing each bite as though savoring not the taste, but the certainty that it would last. He didn't ask for anything else. He didn't speak. When he finished, he placed the container beside him and gave Jack a small, respectful nod. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice rough, barely louder than the wind. Jack stood, unsure what else to say. He told himself that was enough. One meal, one small act. He turned toward the back door, ready to leave the alley behind. That was when he noticed it. As Jack stepped away, the old man shifted his position without thinking, subtly adjusting the angle of his body so he could see both ends of the alley. He straightened his back just enough to relieve pressure from his knees, placing his feet flat despite the snow, shoulders squared, posture alert. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't intentional. It was automatic, ingrained. The kind of movement Jack hadn't seen outside men who had learned to stay alive in worse places than Ridgewood. Jack froze. A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the cold. He stood there, key still in his hand, heart beating a fraction faster as a familiar, unwelcome thought surfaced. He knew that stance. He had worn it himself once, standing guard in the dark, listening for sounds that meant danger. Behind him, the alley was silent again, snow swallowing everything. Jack didn't turn around. Not yet. But the sense that this night was not ordinary, had never been ordinary, settled deep in his chest, heavy and unmistakable, as if something long buried had just shifted beneath the snow. The temperature dropped sharply after midnight, the kind of cold that crept through walls and settled into bone, turning Ridgewood's quiet streets into empty white corridors of frost and breath. Jack Miller stood in the alley longer than he meant to after locking the back door, the old man's posture replaying in his mind with unsettling clarity. He told himself it was coincidence, muscle memory misread in poor light, but the wind cut through his jacket and reminded him of something simpler and harder to ignore. No one that thin would last the night outside, not in this cold. Not with the snow already sealing the ground. Jack exhaled slowly, the sound rough in his throat, and unlocked the door again. He found the old man still there, pressed against the brick, shoulders tight, eyes lifting at the sound of the latch, as if he had been expecting it. "Come inside," Jack said, keeping his voice level. "Just for the night." The man hesitated. Up close, Jack could see the fine tremor in his hands, the way his fingers curled inward as though protecting something fragile. He looked to be in his early 70s, tall once, judging by the length of his limbs, now folded inward by hunger and cold. His eyes were pale, a washed-out blue that carried more fog than fear. And his beard, uneven and gray, framed a mouth set in careful restraint. He did not ask questions. He simply nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, and followed Jack inside with quiet, measured steps. The storage room behind the diner was narrow but clean, lined with shelves of dry goods and folded linens. Jack spread an old blanket on the low cot Sarah used during double shifts. The man removed his coat neatly, folding it with surprising care before sitting. "What's your name?" Jack asked, not pushing, just placing the question gently in the air. The man frowned, brows drawing together, as though the effort itself caused discomfort. "I don't know," he said finally. His voice was steadier indoors, still rough but controlled. "Ethan, maybe. That's what comes back sometimes." Jack nodded. Names could wait. He left him with water and turned off the overhead light. leaving only the small lamp by the door. When Jack finally stepped into the cold again to head home, his mind was louder than the wind. He thought of Emily, asleep in her small bed, of Sarah's worried glances when money came up, of the way this town noticed everything and forgot just as quickly. He told himself it was one night. Just one. Morning came early. Jack returned before sunrise, keys jingling softly as he entered through the back. The diner smelled of yesterday's coffee and cleaning solution, the familiar comfort of routine. He expected to find the old man asleep. Instead, he found him standing by the counter, sleeves rolled neatly, wiping down surfaces with deliberate precision. Chairs had been stacked and restacked until their legs aligned evenly. The floor near the prep area had already been swept. Jack stopped short. Ethan looked up, as if sensing him. "I hope that's all right," he said. "I didn't want to waste space." Jack studied him carefully now. In daylight, the man's movements were slow but exact, each task completed fully before moving on. There was no wandering, no confusion in his hands, only in his eyes when they drifted too long on nothing at all. "You didn't have to," Jack said. "I know," Ethan replied. "But I can." Sarah arrived an hour later, shrugging off her coat as she stepped inside. She paused when she saw Ethan, her sharp eyes taking in the folded posture, the careful distance he kept from the door. Sarah had the look of someone who read rooms for a living, tall, spare-framed, hair pulled back, her fair skin weathered by years of quiet endurance. She said nothing at first, only met Jack's eyes. He gave a small nod. "He's staying the morning," Jack said. Sarah's gaze softened just a fraction. "Coffee?" she asked Ethan. He nodded, grateful but restrained, hands folded loosely at the table as if afraid of claiming too much space. He drank slowly, never looking away from the room for long. When a metal tray slipped from Sarah's hands and clattered against the counter, Ethan flinched sharply, shoulders tightening, eyes snapping to the sound before he seemed to realize where he was. He exhaled and steadied himself, embarrassed. Jack noticed everything. Later, as Ethan changed into one of Jack's old flannel shirts, Jack caught sight of something at the man's chest. A thin chain, worn nearly smooth. Hanging from it was half of a military dog tag, the metal cleanly snapped, the edge jagged, but old. The remaining piece held no name, only a blood type and a partial unit marking too worn to read clearly. Ethan followed Jack's gaze and touched it instinctively. "It broke," he said. "A long time ago, I think." Jack didn't ask how. He had worn his own once. He knew what it meant to keep a piece even when the rest was gone. The morning passed quietly. Ethan worked without being told, never sitting unless invited, never asking for food, only accepting when Sarah set a plate in front of him. There was something deeply familiar in the way he carried himself, not confident, but contained, like someone used to functioning inside rules he no longer remembered. As Jack moved past him near the sink, Ethan's eyes lingered on Jack's forearm. The Marine tattoo there, faded now but unmistakable, caught the light. Ethan stared at it longer than politeness allowed, his expression distant, searching. "Do you," he asked softly, almost to himself, "still dream about the snow?" Jack felt the question land somewhere deeper than expected. He froze, hand tightening around the edge of the counter, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly too loud. He looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and saw not confusion, but recognition struggling to surface. The diner was quiet again, sunlight creeping slowly across the floor. Outside, snow continued to fall, patient and unrelenting. Morning arrived quietly at the diner, the kind of winter morning where sound felt softened by snow. Pale light filtered through the front windows, turning the drifting flakes outside into slow-moving white shadows. Inside, the warmth of coffee and cooked grease settled into the walls, familiar and steady. Ethan stayed. No one had formally said he could, but by the time Jack finished restocking the counter, it was already understood. Ethan moved through the diner with calm, deliberate steps, helping wherever he could without ever asking what to do next. He wiped tables carefully, always starting from the far corner and working inward. He stacked chairs so their legs lined up evenly. When something was out of place, he adjusted it, not to make it look better, but to make it right. Jack noticed that Ethan never asked for anything. Not food, not money, not even a place to sit. When Sarah placed a plate near him, he paused for half a second, then nodded once in thanks before eating quickly and returning to work. There was no hesitation in his movements, no uncertainty. Whatever memory he had lost, discipline had stayed. The regular customers began to notice. Men who came in every morning at the same hour, retired miners, truck drivers, shop owners, started watching the old man with quiet curiosity. Ethan didn't meet their stares. He kept his eyes on his work, his posture slightly hunched but controlled, shoulders angled so he could see the room without turning his head too much. He behaved like someone who understood space and boundaries, and who respected both. Late that morning, the bell over the diner door rang with a sharper tone than usual. Frank Delaney stepped inside. Frank was in his late 60s, tall despite the years, his back still straight under a heavy wool coat that had seen too many winters. His face was long and angular, cut with deep lines that spoke of wind, sun, and years spent outdoors. A thick white mustache rested over a mouth that rarely smiled. His eyes, steel gray and alert, moved through the room the way they always did, measuring, noting exits, habits that never truly faded. Frank was a retired Army infantryman. Everyone in Ridgewood knew that, even if he never talked about it. He sat in his usual booth, back against the wall, eyes angled toward the door. As Ethan passed by to clear a table, Frank's gaze followed him. Not casually, intently. Ethan stopped when Frank spoke. "Hey," Frank said quietly. Ethan turned just enough to face him, keeping his body angled. "Yes?" Frank studied him for a long moment. "You didn't learn that in a shelter," he said, nodding slightly toward the way Ethan stood. Ethan frowned, confusion genuine. "I'm sorry?" Frank shook his head once. "Never mind." But as Ethan walked away, Frank leaned back and muttered under his breath, loud enough for Jack to hear, "That man's not ordinary." The words stayed with Jack. The rest of the morning passed without incident until a sudden sound cut through the diner. A metal tray slipped from Sarah's hands near the service window and crashed against the floor. The sharp clang echoed off tile and steel. Before Jack could react, Ethan moved. He stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between the noise and Emily, who had wandered out from the back room holding a coloring book. His arm came up, not aggressive, not forceful, just enough to shield. His body angled naturally, as if preparing to absorb something worse than sound. It was over in seconds. Ethan realized where he was and lowered his arm, breathing unevenly. Emily looked up at him, startled but unharmed. "It's okay," Ethan said softly, his voice gentler than Jack had ever heard it. Sarah froze, her hand still half raised. Jack felt his chest tighten. He recognized the movement. That night, years ago, in a place far colder and far more dangerous, Jack had stood in falling snow with limited visibility and too much trust in the dark. He remembered the sudden grip on his vest, the force that dragged him sideways just as the ground exploded where he had been standing. He never saw the man who saved him, only felt the strength, heard the urgency. He had survived because someone else had been faster. Jack pushed the memory away, but it didn't fade as easily as it used to. As the diner grew quieter toward the afternoon, Ethan's hands began to shake. He sat at the counter, one palm pressed to his temple, eyes closed tight. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Jack approached slowly. "You okay?" Ethan didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was strained, distant. "Sometimes it comes back," he said. "Not names. Not places, just rules." He opened his eyes. They were clouded now, pale blue, lost behind pain. "There are people," Ethan murmured, almost to himself, "who don't get to return." His fingers tightened briefly against his head. "Some of us," he whispered, "were never meant to." The diner fell silent again. Outside, snow continued to fall, patient, quiet, relentless, covering the ground, hiding what lay beneath. The snow did not stop that day. It fell steadily from morning into afternoon, thickening the air and dulling the edges of Ridgewood until the town felt smaller, quieter, as if the world had drawn inward. Jack Miller watched it through the diner window while refilling the coffee pot, Ethan's words from the day before lingering in his mind like a low, unfinished note. There are people who don't get to return. Jack had heard things like that before, usually from men who drank too much and remembered too clearly. But Ethan had not sounded bitter. He had sounded certain. By late morning, Jack made a decision he could no longer avoid. He wiped his hands on a towel, grabbed his jacket, and told Sarah he would be back in an hour. Sarah looked up from the register, her narrow face tightening with concern. She was a woman in her early 40s, tall and spare, with light brown hair pulled back and skin pale from long winters and longer responsibilities. She had learned, over years of caring for others, to recognize the moment someone stepped toward trouble without meaning to. "You're going to town hall," she said, not asking. Jack nodded. "Just to check something." Sarah studied him for a second longer. "Be careful," she said quietly. It was the kind of warning she had given him before deployments, before surgeries, before nights that changed things. The municipal building sat near the edge of Main Street, a squat, concrete structure with narrow windows and a flag that snapped sharply in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of paper, disinfectant, and old heating vents. Jack approached the Veteran Services desk, where a woman sat behind a computer monitor stacked with forms. Her name tag read Linda Harper. Linda was in her mid-50s, with short, graying hair cut for practicality rather than style. Her glasses hung low on her nose, and her eyes carried the patient weariness of someone who had spent decades explaining rules to people who did not like them. She spoke kindly but firmly, the way one learns to when kindness alone is not enough. Jack explained the situation simply. An older man, possible veteran, partial dog tag, memory loss. Linda typed for several moments, her fingers moving faster than her expression changed. Then she stopped. "That's strange," she murmured. Jack leaned forward slightly. "What is?" She turned the screen just enough that he could not see it. "There is a file," she said carefully. "But I can't open it." Jack frowned. "What do you mean you can't open it?" Linda adjusted her glasses. "It's locked." "Locked how?" She hesitated, then met his eyes. "Federally restricted. That doesn't happen often, usually only for intelligence-related cases or unresolved investigations." Jack felt something tighten in his chest. "So, he's real. There is a record." "Yes," Linda said, "but it's not something I can access." She slid a form across the desk. "If you want to request a review, you'll need to sign here. It won't guarantee anything, it just flags the file." Jack looked down at the paper. He understood forms. He understood signatures. In the Marines, signing your name meant accountability. It meant you had chosen a direction and accepted what followed. He thought of Ethan wiping tables without being asked, of the way he flinched at noise, of the way he had shielded Emily without thinking. Jack picked up the pen and signed. Linda took the form, her mouth set in a thin line. "It may take time," she said. "And, Mr. Miller, sometimes it's better not to dig." Jack gave a brief nod and left. That evening, the diner felt wrong. The lights were on, the grill was hot, the coffee was fresh, but the booths sat empty. No regulars, no truck drivers stopping in to warm up. Even Frank Delaney's usual booth was untouched. Snow pressed against the windows, muting the outside world, until it felt as though the diner existed alone in a white void. Ethan worked quietly behind the counter, drying utensils with slow, careful movements. He seemed calmer than he had earlier, but Jack noticed the way his eyes kept drifting toward the door. "Busy night," Ethan said, trying to sound casual. Jack forced a small smile. "Winter does that." Sarah moved through the room with practiced efficiency, but her eyes kept lifting to the door as well. She had lived long enough to know when absence spoke louder than presence. Near closing time, the phone rang. Jack wiped his hands and picked it up. "Ridgewood Diner." There was silence on the line. Not static, not breathing, just waiting. "Hello?" Jack said again. A voice finally came through, low and controlled, distorted slightly as if spoken through clenched teeth or a poor connection. "You signed a form today." Jack stiffened. "Who is this?" "That's not important," the voice replied. "What is important is that you stop." Jack's grip tightened on the receiver. "Stop what?" "Looking," the voice said flatly. "That man you're helping, he was never meant to be found." Jack felt the room grow colder despite the heat. "He's not a problem," he said. The voice let out something that might have been a breath or a humorless laugh. "He already was." There was a brief pause, then the words dropped with deliberate weight. "Don't dig any deeper. That old man should have disappeared a long time ago." The line went dead. Jack stood there, phone pressed to his ear, the hum of the empty diner loud in the silence. Across the room, Ethan looked at him with quiet concern, as if sensing something had shifted beneath the surface of the snow. Outside, the storm continued, erasing tracks, covering ground, hiding what lay beneath. The diner was already closed when the knock came, firm and deliberate, cutting through the low hum of the refrigeration units and the muted rush of wind outside. Snow pressed against the windows in thick, uneven sheets, blurring the streetlights into pale halos. Jack Miller stood behind the counter, wiping it down one last time, his shoulders tight with a tension that had not left him since the phone call the night before. Sarah moved quietly near the register, tall and spare-framed as always, her light brown hair tied back, pale skin drawn a shade tighter by worry. She had lived long enough with Jack to recognize the signs, the stillness in his posture, the way his eyes tracked sound before thought. Ethan sat on a stool near the prep area, hands folded neatly, gaze drifting toward the back door and then away again, as if he were trying not to anticipate something he already felt coming. The knock came again. Jack did not answer right away. He crossed the diner and looked through the narrow window in the door. Two men stood outside beneath the falling snow. Both wore dark winter coats, cut clean and practical, the kind chosen for function rather than warmth. The first man was tall and broad, his face square and clean-shaven, with close-cropped black hair and eyes that never seemed to blink long enough to rest. The second was shorter and leaner, his sandy beard trimmed close to his jaw, pale eyes sharp behind wire-frame glasses. They stood with professional patience, neither shifting their weight, neither looking hurried. Jack opened the door part way, keeping the chain latched. "We're closed," he said evenly. The taller man raised a hand in a calm, non-threatening gesture. "We understand." "Jack Miller?" Jack's jaw tightened. "That depends who's asking." The shorter man stepped forward slightly and held up an identification badge, angling it just long enough to be seen but not studied. Federal Social Services. We're here regarding an individual currently on your premises. A welfare check. Medical evaluation. Jack glanced at the badge, then at their hands. No folders, no visible paperwork, no vehicle with markings parked nearby. "Do you have a warrant?" he asked. The taller man smiled faintly, the expression never reaching his eyes. "That won't be necessary. This is a standard procedure. We just need to speak with him." Jack shook his head once. "Not without proper documentation. You can come back with a court order." Behind him, Ethan had stood. His breathing had changed, shallow and quick, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The color drained from his face as his eyes fixed on the men beyond the door. The shorter man's gaze shifted past Jack, landing on Ethan with unmistakable focus. "Sir," he said gently, "we're here to help you." Ethan took a step back, bumping into the counter. His voice came out strained. "No," he said, "not again." Jack turned, just enough to place himself between Ethan and the door. "He's not going anywhere," he said. "You'll need to leave." The taller man's expression hardened. "Mr. Miller, you're interfering with a federal process." Jack felt the old instincts rise, slow and steady. "You're on private property. Without a warrant, you don't have authority here." For a moment, the only sound was the wind and the soft tick of cooling metal inside the diner. Then the shorter man exhaled and stepped back, signaling with a subtle nod. "This doesn't have to be difficult," he said. "We'll return when things are clearer." They turned and walked away, their footsteps swallowed by the snow almost immediately. Jack closed the door and slid the bolt into place. The silence that followed felt heavier than the confrontation itself. Ethan sagged against the counter, one hand gripping the edge hard enough that his knuckles went white. His breathing was uneven, his eyes unfocused, darting as though scenes were flashing faster than he could process them. Sarah approached slowly, her movements careful. "Ethan," she said softly, "you're safe." He shook his head, a sharp, almost violent motion. "No," he whispered, "not when it starts to come back." Jack crouched in front of him, lowering his voice. "What comes back?" Ethan pressed his palms against his temples. "The rules," he said. "The orders. The rooms with no windows." His breath hitched. "They told me, if I remembered, they'd come." Jack felt a cold spread through his chest. "Who told you that?" Ethan looked at him then. Truly looked, fear cutting through the fog. "The same people who said I didn't exist anymore." The lights flickered briefly as the wind surged outside. Sarah stood close now, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's shoulder, grounding him with a steadiness born of years spent holding others together. "They said they'd come back," Ethan murmured. "If I remembered too much." Jack straightened slowly, anger and resolve settling into something solid. He glanced at the door, then back at Ethan. "They don't get to decide that anymore," he said. Ethan shook his head, tears gathering in eyes that had seen too much. "They already decided once." The diner fell quiet again, the storm pressing in from all sides, as the weight of what had just begun settled heavily over them all. Snow fell harder that night, thick and heavy, pressing against the diner windows like a warning. The street outside was nearly empty, the town retreating early under the weight of winter. Inside, the lights were dimmed, chairs stacked, the door locked tight. Jack had not gone home. Neither had Ethan. They sat across from each other at a corner booth, the kind Jack usually reserved for late-night regulars who needed quiet more than food. The table between them was bare, no plates, no coffee, just space, as if whatever was about to surface needed room to breathe. Ethan's face looked older under the low light. The deep lines along his cheeks and forehead seemed sharper now, carved by memory rather than time. His gray hair, usually unkempt, was pushed back with restless fingers. His posture kept shifting, straightening, stiffening, then slumping again, like his body couldn't decide which version of him it belonged to. Sarah stood behind the counter, tall and still, her slim frame tense beneath her sweater. Her light brown hair fell loose around her shoulders, pale skin drawn tight with concern. She didn't interrupt. She had learned, over years of waiting tables and watching people break in quiet ways, when silence was the only mercy. Ethan finally spoke. "I remember the file," he said, his voice low but steady. "Not all of it, just enough." Jack leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "What kind of file?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "The kind you don't open, unless you already know how it ends." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the fog was thinner. "I was an officer, logistics and oversight, not front line anymore. My job was to make sure operations followed the rules we said we stood for." Jack felt a familiar knot form in his chest. "There was a winter operation," Ethan continued. "Remote, classified, the kind that doesn't officially exist. Orders came down that didn't sit right. Civilian risk written off as acceptable loss. I refused to sign." His jaw tightened. "They told me I was being reassigned, temporary. Instead, they buried the report. Buried me with it." Sarah's hand tightened on the counter edge. "They erased my service records," Ethan said. "Stripped identifiers, flags placed so no one would look too close. When I didn't disappear quietly enough, that's when the accident happened." Jack's eyes lifted sharply. "You're saying it wasn't random?" Ethan shook his head once. "I don't remember the impact, just the feeling right before. Like someone deciding I was no longer useful." Silence pressed down again, heavier than before. Jack stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-choked street. He thought of the call, the men, the warning, "Don't dig too deep." He thought of his daughter sleeping at home, unaware of how close her world had come to something darker. "They'll come back," Jack said quietly. "With paperwork this time." Ethan nodded. "I know." Jack turned. "If they do, they'll take you." "Yes." Jack's hands curled into fists at his sides. "And if I stop them?" Ethan met his gaze, fully present now. "Then they'll come for you too." Sarah finally spoke. "Jack," she said softly, her voice steady but firm. "You have a child." Jack didn't look at her. He was looking at Ethan, at the man the system had tried to erase and failed. "I won't run," Ethan said. "I've done enough of that." Jack swallowed. The choice pressed in from all sides: duty, fear, responsibility. The Marine training in him screamed caution. The father in him screamed louder. Ethan's breathing shifted, his eyes fixed on something past Jack now, some memory aligning into focus. "There's something else," he said. Jack turned back to the booth slowly. Ethan's voice steadied in a way Jack had not heard before. Clear, certain. "You asked once," Ethan said, "why snow sets you on edge." Jack froze. Ethan continued, each word deliberate. "There was a night, visibility near zero. 2 guard positions, one of them exposed." Jack felt his pulse in his ears. "I saw the pattern," Ethan said. "Wind shift, sound delay. I moved you. Didn't tell you why. Just said trust me." The diner seemed to tilt slightly. Ethan looked at him fully now. "Jack, the night you survived because your position changed." His voice softened, not with weakness but with truth. "That was me." The air left Jack's lungs. He sat down hard across from Ethan, hands gripping the table. The memory surged back with terrifying clarity. The shove, the shout, the explosion where he should have been. "You," Jack whispered. Ethan nodded once.
I didn't think I'd ever remember your face, just the fact that you lived. Jack stared at him, the weight of years collapsing inward.
He laughed once, short and broken, then pressed his palms to his eyes. Outside, the storm howled on, uncaring. Inside the diner, two lives finally aligned around a truth neither had expected to survive. Morning came without drama, the snow easing into a thin, steady fall that softened Ridgewood's edges instead of burying them. The diner opened on time. Jack unlocked the door, flipped the lights, and stood for a moment listening to the familiar sounds. The hum of the freezer, the low hiss of the grill warming, the building settling as if it recognized him. It felt like choosing a direction and taking the first step, even if the road ahead was still hidden. Ethan arrived a few minutes later, moving slower now, not from weakness, but from intention. He wore a clean wool coat Sarah had found in the back and pressed into his hands with a look that dared him to refuse. His gray hair was combed back, his face still lined and weathered, but the tension had loosened. The man who had lived by rules he could no longer name now lived by a quieter one. Stay present. Jack poured coffee. Ethan sat at the counter, hands folded, eyes tracking the room with a gentler awareness. When the bell over the door rang, he didn't flinch. The days that followed unfolded with surprising calm. The calls stopped. The unmarked cars did not return. Whatever pressure had hovered over Ridgewood seemed to dissolve, not with an announcement, but with absence. Jack didn't trust it at first. Marines learn that silence can be a tactic. Still, when a thick envelope arrived bearing official seals and neutral language, the silence finally made sense. Jack opened it after closing, Ethan beside him. The letter was careful, almost apologetic. It acknowledged an administrative error, a review concluded. A status restored without comment on methods. No full confession, no names. But there it was, recognition. Service affirmed, benefits reinstated. A quiet correction, delivered as if it had always been inevitable. Ethan read it twice, then folded the paper and placed it on the counter. He didn't cry. He simply closed his eyes and breathed, as if setting down a weight he'd carried for years without knowing why. I don't remember everything, he said, voice steady. But I remember enough. That's more than most get, Jack replied. Word traveled the way it always does in small towns. Slow at first, then all at once. Regulars came in with nods that lingered. Frank Delaney raised his coffee in a wordless salute. Sarah smiled more often, the lines around her eyes softening. The diner didn't change its menu or its hours, but something else shifted. People stayed longer. They talked. Stories surfaced, lost jobs, bad winters, choices that sent them drifting until a warm place brought them back to themselves. Ethan stayed, not as a guest, not as a charity case. He took a stool by the window in the mornings, wiping menus with a care that felt ceremonial. He learned the rhythm of the place, when to step in, when to step back. He laughed sometimes, surprised by the sound. When memories failed him, he didn't apologize. He simply asked, and the answer came. Emily began stopping by after school, her backpack too big for her shoulders, her hair always escaping its tie. She sat at the counter and told Ethan about spelling tests and snow days, and the feral cat that watched from the alley. Ethan listened like a man who understood that attention was a gift. He never called her kid. She never called him sir. Your family, she said one afternoon, as if stating a fact she'd confirmed for herself. Ethan nodded, accepting it with the humility of someone who knew what the word cost. Jack watched it all from behind the counter, the pride and fear braided tight in his chest. He'd chosen a line and stood on it, and the world hadn't ended. It had widened. Some nights, when the diner emptied and the lights dimmed, he thought about the road not taken, the one where he'd opened the door and let Ethan be carried away. He didn't regret his choice. Regret belonged to the past. Responsibility belonged to now. Winter eased into spring. The snow retreated from the sidewalks. The diner's windows opened for the first time in months, letting in air that smelled like thawing earth and coffee. A hand-lettered sign appeared near the register. Help wanted, part-time. It wasn't a promise, it was an invitation. On a quiet evening, Jack locked up and found Ethan standing by the door, coat on, eyes thoughtful. "I don't know where I would have gone," Ethan said. Jack shrugged. "Turns out you didn't need to." They stepped outside together. The street lights hummed. Ridgewood looked like itself, ordinary, stubborn, alive. Jack thought of the night he'd handed a hot meal to a man digging through trash, and how close the world had been to folding in on itself. He thought of maps and how they weren't lines so much as choices you made again and again. Ethan paused, then spoke softly, as if setting the last piece into place. "Some people don't lose their homes," he said. "They lose the way back." Jack nodded. "And sometimes," he added, "kindness is the map." They walked down the street, the diner behind them glowing warm and steady, a place that had learned what it was for. Sometimes we wait for miracles to arrive like thunder, loud, undeniable, divine. But more often, God's miracles come quietly. They arrive as a warm meal on a cold night, a door opened when it would have been easier to walk away, a hand extended without knowing the outcome. In our daily lives, we pass moments like these every day. A stranger in need, a choice between fear and kindness. And in those small decisions, God works through us. This story is a reminder that when we choose compassion, we may be answering a prayer we never heard. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of faith, kindness, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you, today and always.